Hi, my name's Alan Smith, and in this webcast we're going to look at using Logic Apps with Azure API Management. The Logic App that I'm going to be using is the one I built in the Logic Apps and Vision AI webcast. So we'll look at how we can add the Logic App as an API in API Management, how we can secure access to the API using products, subscriptions and API keys, how we can modify the URL to make it more readable, and also how we can use policies to limit the call rate to the API. This is a demo that I very often do on my training courses, so if you're interested in training or mentoring, there's details in the description below. And I've also included links to the relevant documentation in the description. In one of my previous webcasts, I created a Logic app that can use the Microsoft AI services to be able to detect cars and celebrities. Now what I'd like to do is to make this Logic app available to other applications within my organisation and maybe to people outside of my organisation. So currently, this is the actual URL for the Logic app. I've got Postman that I can use to send requests to that URL. So what I can do is I can select a file, take one of these images, send it to the Logic app, and we get back the prediction that this is a Tesla Model S in the image. We've got Elon Musk identified as a celebrity, and the description is that this photo is Elon Musk standing in front of a car. So this is really good, really quick to build that. However, when we look at the actual URL that has been used to expose the Logic app, if I copy this and drop to Notepad and paste this in, I'm going to drop some line breaks in this URL just to clarify what it means. So here we've got prod20.centralus.logic.azure.com. So that's the actual location of the particular Logic app. We've then got /workflows, and we've got the ID of the actual workflow there. You can see that particular workflow ID. And then we've got this triggers manual paths invoke. We've got the API version, and then we've got some encrypted stuff talking about the trigger manual run. We've got the service version, and we've got the actual signing signature that's used as the credential for being able to call that Logic app. Now this isn't ideal for sharing within my organisation and especially outside the organisation for a number of reasons. This is basically tied to Central US. This is the production environment for Logic Apps, prod20, or it's one of the production environments for Logic Apps, and Central US is the region, and then we've got logicazure.com. I would like this to be something that's more close to my organisation. Also, if I move the Logic app to a different region, this part of the URL will change. If I delete it and redeploy it, it's maybe going to be prod18 or prod26 or something. So this is going to be changing. Also, this is the actual workflow ID. I'd like to be at something more meaningful, like identify celebrities, use the actual name of the Logic app. And then the signature, well, we've got one of these that can be used for all people who are making calls to that Logic app. There's no granularity in the security. So if I give this to my application developers and to my customers, then I decide that a customer shouldn't be able to make calls to this anymore, I'm going to have to change the URL, and that's going to break all of the other applications. So what we're going to look at is how we can use API management to get rid of all of these problems in this URL and make the URL much more easy to use and easy to work with. Also, how we can actually work with granular security. And as a bonus, we'll look at how we can use policies in API management to do rate limiting onto this URL and kind of limit the number of calls that a particular client can make to this actual service. Okay. So what I'm going to do first is to create an instance of the API management service. So if I go to the resource group, I'm going to create API management. So click on create there, and it's going to be in this resource group. I'll drop it in the Central US region, so it's the same as the actual Logic app that I'm using. The resource name will be Logic App APIs. That needs to be globally unique, and that name is available. Organization name, I'll just put Alan in there and put my email address. This is just where any notifications are going to be sent from the API management service. Now the pricing tier, we do have a developer tier if we want to use that. However, the development tier is not going to be free. It's going to cost 507 krona per month. That's about $50 a month, which is quite expensive for just having a service for experimentation. We've also got the options of using basic and standard and premium, and this is when things do start to get really expensive when we go on towards these tiers. However, the best option for small projects and also for prototyping and labbing, proof of concepts and stuff, is this consumption tier. We basically get 1 million calls per subscription included, per Azure subscription. That means I can use this service pretty much for free. And then we basically get billed on the additional calls that we make per 10,000 calls. There is a point at which the basic edition becomes less expensive than the consumption. If we basically start consuming millions and millions of calls, this is going to add up to more than the monthly cost for the basic. But in most low utilization scenarios, the consumption plan is going to be the best option. Also, it will take about 45 minutes to provision the developer and the basic, and we don't want to wait that long. So I'm going to choose consumption here, and then I'm going to click on create and create again to create that service. It will take a couple of minutes, so I'll pause the recording whilst that is deploying. Okay, so the deployment is complete. We can navigate to the instance of API Management. And the first thing that I'm going to do here is to add an API. We've got various choices here. We can manually define an HTTP API, we can use WebSockets, we can use GraphQL. We can import an Open API, which is the format that's formerly known as Swagger. I think everybody still calls it Swagger, but it's the same thing as Swagger here. We've also got Waddle and WSDL for working with SOAP-based APIs. And then in the Azure services, we can work with Logic Apps, App Services, Functions Apps, and Container Apps. So I'm going to select Logic App. I'm going to select the Logic App that I created, which was the Cars and Celebs, and select that. And for the API suffix, I'm going to drop in Cars and Celebs there. So we can see that we've got the basic URL that's going to be used for that. So it's looking like we're solving the first problem. Instead of it having prod20.centralus.logic.azure.com, we've got a URL that's starting out with Logic App APIs, which is something that I chose myself, .azureapi.net/cars and celebs. So that's much more usable. It's also static. If I move my Logic App somewhere else, I can point that API definition at the new Logic App, and this URL is not going to change. Okay, so let's create that API. And what it's going to do is it's going to analyze the Logic App, and it's going to create the definition for that API within API Management. Okay, so we've got a post method here to be able to call this. I always get a bit nervous when I see this 500 internal error, but this is just showing the responses that can come back. It can give a 200 or it can give a 500 if something goes wrong. We've got the options to be able to test this. So when I'm testing the API, what I can do is say that we'll use binary data. I'm going to select a file, and I'm going to take the Elon Tesla file, and we can send that. And we're getting 400 bad request. Now, if you look at the request that we're sending, the actual content type there has a value of application JSON. If we go into Postman, here I'm actually making a call directly to the Logic App, and we can basically see in the headers here that I'm specifying the content type is going to be image JPEG. So all I want to do is to copy this, drop back to API Management, and just specify that this is the content type we're going to be using, image JPEG, and make that request. Okay, this came back with a 200 OK. We can scroll down and we can see that we're getting the same output that we got from the actual Logic App. So what I need to do now is to call this API from within Postman. So I'm going to copy this path here, which is the request URL for the API. And within Postman, what I can do is just duplicate this tab, which will take the request body that I'm sending in and send it to this actual URL. So I'm going to modify the URL for the one in API Management and send in this request. Okay, so what we're getting back here is a 401, access denied due to missing subscription key. Make sure to include a subscription key when making requests to the API. Now this is good. This basically means that my API is not available by default with anonymous access. I'm going to need to provide some kind of credentials for this API. And if you go to the actual settings, we can see here that we're actually sending in the subscription key. And what's happening here is we're basically using, because we're an administrator in API management, it will do this for us. However, as a caller of the API, we do need to specify this OCP APIM subscription key. Now, in order to call this, we're going to need a subscription and we're going to need a product. So what I'm going to do is to create a new product in API management. This will be called Test API. So this is what the test team can use for testing. I'm going to select this project to published, and I'm going to add the Cars and Celebs API to that particular product. We can generate different products, so I could generate one for the actual applications, or one for internal applications, and one for customers. And within the Test API's product, I want to generate a subscription. So I'll generate a subscription here for Alan. And when I generate that subscription, it's going to generate a primary and a secondary API key. Now, these can be used by me to make calls to that particular service. So what I can do is copy the primary key, go back to Postman. In the headers, I'm going to paste in that key value. And I'll go back to the APIs and just in the settings, I'm going to copy the text for OCP APIM subscription key, so I don't get any typos in that. And I can send in this request. And you can see that we're getting the valid response coming back there. So let's create another subscription. If I go back to the products, test APIs, and subscriptions, I can add another subscription here for John. And that means John has his API keys. So I can copy John's key, back to Postman, we can duplicate this tab. And in the headers, I'm going to change the value of the subscription key to the one that we've got for John. So John can now make calls to this API. I've also got the option of suspending and resuming subscriptions. So here we can say, okay, well, let's suspend John's subscription so that he can no longer make calls to the API. So you can see that that one is suspended. If we drop back here in Alan's subscription, I can still make requests. However, in John's subscription, we've got this access denied due to invalid subscription key. So I can go back in, I can activate the subscription, back to Postman and send the request. And you can see that we're able to call this API again. So we've now solved the problem of having to use this single signature for all of the clients. I've now got different API keys that I can use for different clients. So this is giving me my granular control of being able to grant access to a person or an application, and then be able to suspend that access when I need to, and have really a good control over the security. Okay, this is looking a lot better. However, I'm not too keen on having this manual /path/invoke in the URL here, because this has basically come from the Logic Apps URL. You can see that we've got manual /path/invoke, and it doesn't really make sense to have that as part of the API that we're publishing. It kind of gives away that we're using Logic Apps. So within API management, if I go back to the APIs, and I go to the post method, I can open the properties here, and you can see that we're actually posting to, and manual paths invoke is in here. So what I can just do is change it to analyze. Then I can copy this, we can save this, and I can drop back to Postman and just change that there in this tab here. So if we drop back to Notepad, you can see that now the URL is logicapapis.azureapi.net/carsandcelebs/analyze. So we've got really good control over how we form these URLs, and this is much more consumable than the original one that we had for the Logic App itself. So within the products, this is for test APIs. It's really for people to make testing on the APIs that we're publishing. However, as they're doing that, we are going to be paying money for the Logic Apps that are being run, and also for making calls out to the various cognitive services. So if somebody decides to stress test this API instead of just running a regular test, I may end up with a really big bill. Also, they may decide to use it in a production scenario and start running lots and lots of calls through that API. I don't want that to happen either. So what I'd like to do is to be able to limit the number of calls that can be made to this particular API. We see this quite often in Microsoft Azure. So if we go back to the computer vision service and we go to the pricing tier, you can see that we've got this free pricing tier. You're allowed one of these per subscription. This limits to 20 calls per minute, and we've got 5,000 calls per month. So what I'd like to do is to do something similar with my test API and say, well, the subscribers can make a certain number of calls to this API within a certain amount of time, and maybe put a quota on it. So this bit is known as rate limiting. We're kind of limiting how many calls they can make in a particular short space of time. When we think about these longer durations like a month, this is kind of like a service quota. You can make these calls per month. They pretty much do the same thing. However, they tend to have different terminology when one is per month and one is per minute. And you can see the standard has this limit of 10 calls per second on it. That's the rate limiting on the standard tier. So in order to do this, we're going to generate a policy on the API. So if I go back to the APIs and to the Cars and Celebs API, we can start to look at the actual policies. So this is the policy on the method that we've got here, this post method. And you can see that it's already generated some XML in the actual policy definition. Now what this is doing is when we make a call to this, we're going to pass in the API management subscription key. We don't want to send that header value down to the actual logic app. So what this is saying is this is basically an APIM generated policy, and it's the set header policy. So if the header name is equal to OCP APIM subscription key, then we're going to delete that particular header. So we've got the options of adding headers and deleting headers. We've also got this one here, which is a URL rewrite, and this is actually changing the URL from this manual paths invoke and basically modifying this to an actual template. You can see that the signature here is obfuscated. We don't actually see the signature that's used to call a logic app because that's considered to be private information here. So that's how they're going from the simple URL that we send in to the more complex URL that's used to call the logic app. We can also define our own policies. There is a policy definition language that we can use. So if we Google for APIM policy, we can see the actual policy reference that we've got here. And there's all kinds of stuff that we can do with, working with control flow, working with caching, working with security, configuring retries, mocking responses. There's all kinds of stuff that we can do here. But what I'm going to look at is limiting the call rate per subscription for these testers who are making calls to the API. And you can see that we've got an example here. It's the rate limit policy, where here they've got 20 calls within a 90-second period, and the variable that they're going to be using is remaining calls per subscription. So what I can do is just basically copy this bit of the XML. I can go back to the APIs, and in this method I can actually drop in. And I can paste in that particular policy. So I'm going to change this to 3 calls within a 60-second renewal period and click on Save. So going back to Postman on this tab, this is the Allen subscription. So I'm going to make some calls to this API from here. And you can see when I made more than 3 calls, it's saying we're getting this status code 429, which is rate limit exceeded. Try again in 51 seconds. And it's saying try again in 41 seconds. If I go to John's subscription, John can still make calls to the API. However, if John attempts to make more than 3 calls to the API within a 60-second period, you can see we're getting that rate limit exceeded. Go back to my subscription, and we're down now to 22 seconds. So eventually, after a while, I should be able to make some additional calls to that API. You can see it's now down to 15 seconds. And down to 12 seconds. So rate limiting is really useful and really easy to put on within API management. You may want to set something that's fairly reasonable where people can actually use the service quite freely within their applications. However, if they start to place too much load on the service, which is going to result in either a service degradation for other users or extensive billing within your application, then you can basically limit them from those actual calls. So you can see that we're getting a successful call on this API again, and another successful call. And if I go back to John's tab, then John can make a call against that particular API. So takeaways from this, if you're using Logic apps, if you're exposing them over HTTP, I would definitely recommend using API management. In low-load scenarios, you really want to be using the consumption tier. That's going to be basically, well, almost free to use. It's not going to cost you too much in low-load scenarios. If you find that the billing on this is getting too expensive as you're making more and more calls, as the actual load increases, you can switch on to the basic tier, and that's going to give you a certain amount of quota, a certain amount of performance, but you won't be paying on a per call basis for this. As far as the policy language goes, it's pretty easy to configure these policies, and there is a lot of stuff here to configure. So it's great being able to go in and do all of these settings. You know, caching is good to be able to work with. Validating tokens, validating certificates and various things is easy to configure. Modifying the actual URL and changing the request and the response. And also having the functionality to change the address of the URL. I mentioned that, you know, if the Logic app is changing location, we've got the option of setting this to a different endpoint. So this is the default one for the Logic app. I could override this and put in a different URL if I wanted to. And that would basically mean that we could point at a different Logic app. I could even do the implementation as an Azure function instead of a Logic app and point the endpoint to an Azure function. And the customers, the clients of the API, wouldn't even know that we'd changed the implementation.